I'm Tim, welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. Once again, we are waking up with watches. Everything you see here is for sale. Price is down in the description unless the watch is so new it's not on our site yet, in which case email for pricing, but this is a bit of a coming attraction in any event because some of these watches are so new even the sales team doesn't know they're here. Let's remind everyone that we are working on the set. I know that's been a bone of contention, much improved. Lighting is coming next. Let's start off with the many-sided god of watch collecting. The octagonal royal oak here in a compelling 41mm stainless steel perpetual calendar form. This is a watch that was launched in late 2015 for the 2016 model year, the arrival of the 41mm case in the long-running Royal Oak Perpetual family. The first Royal Oak Perpetual launched back in 1981, so it's been around almost as long as the Royal Oak itself, launched only 9 years prior. Now the timepiece does have that weekly calendar design whereby the flange or the Reha outboard features 52 individual weeks, and then you have a pointer indicator with a cruciform symmetry about the pantograph cut Grand Tapisserie dial, so you can cut it top to bottom or side to side and it would be symmetrical. Now you have an aventurine moon phase disc, which I find exquisite and beautiful, and the Cosmos itself is made of aventurine. There is a photorealistic moon on top of it. You can see that there are slightly blackened indices and hands for contrast against the base, hexagonal white gold, perfectly aligned bezel bolts, and then you can see the same hexagon in the form of the crown. Now let's throw this watch on the wrist. As a 41, it does wear far larger than the standard 39mm jumbo. You can see it's a little bit thicker too, at about 10mm thick, despite being a perpetual calendar. That's quite impressive. Perpetual calendar and automatic. It sits low enough that you will be able to fit it underneath formal cuffs, and you can see on my 16cm circumference wrist, it's a broad watch. I always tell people with Royal Oaks, size down, wear a smaller size than you'd normally wear. 41mm, but trust me, it wears more like a 43. It is a watch with serious stance across the wrist. Now the bracelet, the case, and the bezel are absolutely essential to understanding the appeal of this watch. As the finishing that goes into the metal, you can see the polished edge, the satin finished centers. You can see that the faces of the intermediate links inboard, they are actually polished, and as you roll the bracelet, you can see those polished inner faces. They're polishing things you can barely see. Vertical satin finish on the side, and the bracelet feels as good as it looks. With so much time, again, 9 to 11 hours spent finishing the bracelet, the case, and the bezel, you're getting a watch that is not just hand finished internally, but externally and substantially. Now when I turn the watch over, you can see the movement on the case back. This is the caliber 5134, and you can see that it's based on the old Jaeger-LeCoultre 920 Bausch, which was designed for AP, Patek, and Vacheron, and launched back in 1967, only ever used by the Holy Trinity brands, never used by JLC itself. Today, this movement, which in its basic form is under 3mm thick, is made in-house by Audemars Piguet for AP's use as well as that of Vacheron. Now you can see that the finishing here is also higher than what you get on a standard Audemars Piguet 4302 or 3120 automatic, and this is important because the low production rate of these watches is principally due to the low production rate of the movement. 19,800 vibrations per hour, free-sprung 5-position adjustment with a Gyromax style balance. It is designed using the best traditions in terms of finish and engineering of high horology watchmaking. 40-hour automatic winding power reserve, mirrored bevels, black polished screws with chamfered slots, all of that in a case that is imposing on the wrist but elegant enough to be your dress watch when need be. Now for those who can't quite come to terms with the 41mm case, that's all right, because we have one of my personal favorites here. This was the just right watch. The porridge was just right when AP launched the 15300, a relatively short-lived automatic in 39mm that was in production from about 2007 to the end of 2011. 39mm, you can see here the Grand Tapisserie dial, also pantograph cut, but blue galvanized, a special color reserved for AP boutiques as well as premier Audemars Piguet dealers. It is uncommonly seen because oftentimes the galvanizing process would go wrong and thus the production was slow. As a result, the blue dial style is generally the most sought. You can see white gold hands and indices and AP logo. The bolts, white gold inside the bezel. They're steel on an offshore. They are gold on a royal oak. And this one's swimmable. While the perpetual calendar is 20 meters, this one is 50 meters, albeit with a screw-down crown. So this is a swimmable sports watch. Throw it on the wrist and you can see immediately the 39 millimeter case is more wearable across the wrist as the bracelet arcs and curves more at the edges of my wrist. So you can see if your wrist is as small as 14 centimeters circumference, you're going to find this one a good match. And if you don't like the feel of the 41 or the offshore, this is a timepiece that is going to give you access to the Royal Oak Dream without the expense and delicacy of a 15202 or a 15002. Now, this is a timepiece that is considerably slimmer than a offshore. Although it's broad across the wrist, it is flat at about 9 millimeters thick. So this is a timepiece that's narrower across the wrist, narrower in cross section, and just as distinctive as any Royal Oak. It clearly bears the marks of the master, the rounded octagonal bezel, the satin finished tops, the polished edges, the bezel bolts, and of course the integrated bracelet finished with the same exhaustive care and attention to detail as on the perpetual calendar. You're getting a very hand-finished watch there as well. Now, what's nice about this watch is that inside it's just as nicely executed. Although, admittedly, the 3120 is more machine finished than the 5134 we just saw, it is also more advanced and tougher. You can see there's almost a batarang-shaped full batwing bridge with a free-sprung index for the balance, robustly bracing it against shock. This base movement was designed for the offshore, so it was designed tough from the beginning. 60-hour power reserve compared to 40 for the perpetual calendar. You have a 22-karat engraved mass with the coats of arms of the Audemars and Piguet family, designed to remind you that since 1875, Audemars Piguet remaining the only large Swiss watchmaker still in the hands of the founding family. It beats away at 21.6, which is a slower rate, but the enormity of the balance and its inertia make up for its lack of beat rate. A great looking movement and a great looking watch, and the timepiece, possibly the best of all possible worlds. More durable than the Jumbo, more wearable than the later 41s. Now, if you want to talk about watches that are perhaps a little bit more accessible, you have to talk about mainstream brands. But that doesn't mean you have to compromise. If you like the fact that the Royal Oak can be worn as a sports watch or a dress watch, you have to consider the current generation Omega Seamaster Aqua Terra. Now, this is the 2017 and later Aqua Terra, which features the horizontal teak deck dial. It also features the movement of the date disc from 3 o'clock down to 6, and we do away with the shear guard or crown guard structure on the flank. We have a conical crown. It's actually inverse conical. It's wider at its outer edge than it is inboard. And then we have no real crown guard structure. What we also have is a master chronometer movement inside. Now, what you might not be able to see, because we're still working on lighting in here, is that this is a blue metallic dial. So it's a blue metallic dial with a few well-chosen cyan accents, and then applique indices, the timepiece featuring a 150 meter water resistance and a 41 millimeter stainless steel case. What I'm going to do real quick now is throw it on the wrist so you can get a sense of how it wears. It's relatively narrow across the wrist, less than 48 millimeters. You can see how much clearance there is on both sides of my wrist. This is a timepiece that's going to wear well on a wrist as small as 13.5 centimeters circumference, and it is on a full rubber strap. So if you want to take your highly water resistant watch 150 meters swimming, you can do so on this rubber strap, which looks adult enough and refined enough for formal attire, but it's also rough enough that you don't have to worry about switching out leather before jumping in the water. Now, the timepiece features an interesting refinement that sets it apart from the caliber 8800s that you'll see, for example, on the Diver 300 meter. And it has this independent setting hour stepper, so I can set the hour hand, and note how the date is jumping back and forth. I can actually set the date forward or backwards as I travel across the international date line. Note the watch is still keeping time. For world wanderers, this is a wonderful refinement that allows you to keep up with your travels without affecting the master chronometer precision of the watch. Now, you can see it's a screw-down crown. There's a little bit more to it. Turn it all over and you can see Omega caliber 8900. Now, this is a master chronometer. What does that mean? It means the METAS standard set by the Swiss Federal Institute of Metrology and researched in coordination with Omega is applied. So rather than a bare movement test in 5 positions, the watch is tested for chronometric precision to the COSC standards in 6 positions rather than 5, and is a fully cased up watch rather than a bare movement. But there's more. There's also tests of power reserve, winding efficiency. There's a test of shock resistance and anti-magnetism, and with a silicon hairspring, this watch is effectively amagnetic. It can deal with proximity to MRIs and particle accelerators. You and your watch may be stuck to the machine, but make no mistake, it is not going to lose or gain time. Full balance bridge with a free-sprung index for shock resistance and a 60-hour power reserve with a coaxial escapement that remains, in my opinion, still the most advanced escapement you can purchase below $50,000. There is a lot to love about this Aqua Terra. Now, a watch that began as a sports watch, but ultimately can be considered an all-arounder by today's standards, the much-loved and much-heralded Omega Speedmaster Professional Moonwatch. Now, the timepiece right here is the icon of Omega, just as the Submariner, the GMT, and the Rolex, and the Submariner, the GMT, and the Daytona are Rolex. The Speedy Moonwatch Professional is Omega. This timepiece was part of a family launched in 1957 for motorsports. The watch's original intention, as cued by the name Speedmaster, was to be used for motorsports. At the time, during the 1950s, Rolex chronographs were popular in the flying mile and stock car competitions down on the beach at Daytona, and with that in mind, the Speedmaster was created as the CK2915 in 1957. Well, by 1965, it had been flight certified by NASA, and the advent of the professional refinements, the larger 42mm case, the lyre-style lugs, the shear guards for the crown and pusher, all of that led to the professional nomenclature on the dial. Now, which came first, the professional nomenclature or the acceptance? It's actually hard to say, but chronologically, they are close. Now, what sets this watch apart today is that it has a perfectly balanced, no-nonsense, white-on-black dial in matte to resist glare. There's no date window, which aids its viability as a dress watch. And as you can see, the timepiece featuring the thermoplastic, as the Hesselite crystal, as Omega calls it, is easier to scratch than a sapphire, but it's kept to this day because NASA and Omega agree that being much harder to shatter than a sapphire, it's less likely to leave debris floating around in zero gravity. So we have that lovely off-axis distortion as though this were a vintage watch. Throwing it on the wrist, 42mm must have been ungodly huge back in the 1960s, but today you can see it actually wears like a average-sized men's sports complication. The timepiece having a broad stance of about 53mm across the wrist if you include the solid end links of the bracelet. It's a timepiece that has a lot of presence and it will wear easily under a jacket cuff, although you can see with the cantilever of the tachometer bezel, the timepiece does tend to get caught up on the tightest of dress sleeves. No matter, it's an elegant and graceful watch, especially when paired with alligator leather that has a tremendous stylistic range from black tie all the way down to, well, shorts and t-shirt, with a possible diversion for those times when you must wear a spacesuit. And yes, the watch with the caliber 1861 Moonwatch movement on the inside, the movement that is not just certified for flights, but also extravehicular activity. That's right, spacewalks. It is designed to be shocked. It is designed to be frozen. It is designed to be fried, taking a licking and keeping on ticking. Well, I'm paraphrasing there, and I'm actually appropriating someone else's tagline, but it's apropos for this watch. Manual wind 48-hour power reserve with a tank-tough cam lateral clutch system. It is designed to be shock resistant up to impulse levels of 5,000 G, which actually exceeds the shock resistance of the later X33. This is tough stuff. 42mm in stainless steel for your wrist. Now, if you want a timepiece that is thinner and will assuredly fit underneath any dress cuff, but you don't want to give up durability, you still want to be able to swim with your watch and consider it a full-fledged sporting model, something like this might be right up your alley. Or right up your sleeve, as the 8.5mm thickness of the Nautilus 5711 1R makes it a timepiece that will fit underneath any dress cuff, with the image penned by Gerald Genta in 1976, still with the wings profiling across at about 42.5mm, even though the size nominally is about 40mm. The watch is slender, the watch is durable, the watch is unusually rich, as the Nautilus is generally associated with stainless steel, but here, all in rose gold, you get that same level of of finish to the metal, albeit with a much more opulent material. And the dial, rose gold hands, rose gold applique indices. You can see the horizontal striations of a standard Nautilus dial, but you'll also note that it's a brown bronze gradient, metallic and more bronze at the center, fading to almost black by its outer periphery. You'll appreciate that the bracelet is as lovingly finished as what we saw on the Royal Oaks, but it has a silkier feel as the links are smaller and thinner, and you can really see that to good advantage. When we compare the bracelet thickness of the Nautilus to the Royal Oak, you could see that the Nautilus has that gossamer grace, the slender profile, the lightness, the fluidity on the wrist that comes with much smaller, individually pliant links. So this is a watch that in many regards is going to feel more like a dress model on the wrist, even as it exceeds the water resistance of that Royal Oak by 100 meters. The perpetual calendar only 20 meters resistant. Now on the wrist you can see how low slung it really is. Any cuff can ramp up over the side of this watch. It ticks away, graceful, handsome, stately, and while it might be a bit much for the likes of Chicago, London, or New York, it feels very Miami, LA, or Nice. This is the kind of watch that would be absolutely at home on the French or Italian Riviera, a special kind of watch for a special kind of buyer. This is not the 5711 for everyone. It takes a little bit more of a discerning taste for, as I said earlier, opulence, the posh lifestyle, to make this your ideal Nautilus. Technically identical to the standard 5711 though. The watch wears an absolute treat on the wrist. Let me do what I can real quick to show you the case back. Caliber 324, automatic winding, handsomely executed. This is going to be a little bit of a challenge right here, but let me attempt some gymnastics. You could see that the movement, Harrison's doing a great job. He has my sympathy right now. Harrison doing a great job of showing you to the 324. You can see circular Côte de Genève on the rotor, linear Côte de Genève on the bridges, Patek Philippe seal, guaranteed accurate to -3 +2 seconds a day, Gyromax free sprung balance adjusted in 6 positions, mirrored chamfering on the edge of the bridges, and black polished screw heads with chamfered slots. My favorite feature that is difficult to showcase, let me see if I can show this to you right here. Take another angle. But there is a Nautilus-like swirl of perlage on the center of the rotor, and that right there is the single cleverest detail of the finish. It has a Nautilus shell-like swirl on the center of the rotor, well suited to a watch known as the Nautilus. Now, a lot of folks are into sports watches, but they come only from Rolex. The market adores Rolex, and as I mentioned, there are some who believe that Rolex is literally the only watch in the world and the only sports watch to choose. I don't feel that way, which is why I often like the offbeat Rolex models, call them the counterculture choices, and the Explorer II 42 certainly is that. Against the flood of GMTs, subs, and Daytonas, I happen to love the Polar Dial 42 as it's a graceful and somewhat shocking choice by Rolex. Graceful because the 42mm case gives it the look of a high aspect ratio with a relatively slender case profile in comparison to its width and its lug-to-lug span. When this watch debuted at Basel World 2011, it was a little bit of a quasi-Steve McQueen revival with the presence of the white dial, the orange arrow, and the radial satin grain of the bezel emanating from an imaginary center point. All of this recalling the original 1655. And this is a timepiece that has a lot of that aesthetic, but with a much higher degree of quality. Now, this is not a conventional Rolex silver white dial. This is a chalk white, a white dial. You'll note the use of blackened hands and indices for high contrast, as well as the presence of a blackened semi-lollipop counterweighted seconds hand. So legibility day or night is outstanding. Blue Rolex chromolite lume. This watch uses a movement that was only ever fitted to this model. It's called the 3187. And it is distinct from the 3186 in its use of Rolex's proprietary Paraflex shock protection system, as well as its larger date disc. Now you can see the watch actually wears its Cyclops eye much more gracefully than a standard Rolex because the dial is bigger, so the Cyclops eye doesn't crowd, but with a white date disc and a white dial, the two blur together. You can see that I'm able to step the hour hand forward and backwards. The watch is still keeping time, as we did with the Aqua Terra, but here we have two time zones, one 12 hours, one 24 hours, and you can set them separately. The idea behind the original Explorer II was that you would have a watch suitable for cave explorers who needed to be reminded of whether they were looking at AM or PM. But with the arrival of a true dual-time Explorer II in the mid-80s, it became a consummate traveler's watch, able to show you the time where you are not and the time where you are. 100 meters water resistant and automatic winding with a full oyster bracelet and professional grade clasp. This is a timepiece that is a general sports watch. And you can see that the clasp itself features both the lift lock system as it pivots and has a beak and a hook mechanism for locking, but then it also has a clamshell system, so it locks not once but twice, while also including the EasyLink 5mm tool-free adjustment system. You can see right there, EasyLink, maybe if I hold it inverted it would be easier to see. EasyLink allows you to add or remove 5mm of bracelet length, the equivalent of adding or removing one of these removable links, and you can do it without any tools. Throw it on the wrist, it's a big watch, but it's a watch that I would wear well. As you can see, though broad across the wrist, it's nice and flat, giving it an elegance you don't expect in a 42mm super case Rolex. And you can see that because it is a relatively thin watch, it sits low on the wrist, low like a Daytona, meaning it's easily amenable to any kind of a tight dress cuff, and you will have absolute no trouble with a jacket of any kind. I can recommend it for a wrist as small as 14.5 centimeters circumference, and I don't often say that in conjunction with a 42mm case. Now, Rolex and Daytonas. I wanted to include a Daytona, but I didn't want the Daytona that everyone wants or everyone has, which is why I've chosen a classic, the Zenith Daytona. Launched in 1988, this watch was different from the Daytonas that came before in almost every respect. While those were roughly 37.5mm, this one was 40. While those were about 50 meters water resistant with screw down crowns, this one was 100. While those were all manual wind, this one was automatic. While those were only occasionally chronometer certified, all of these were. And while the previous watches featured plexiglass, this one featured sapphire. It was a huge upgrade and a milestone. It was a watershed. The Daytona became a phenomenon that continues to this day, and the steel model, this one is an A-series from 1999, was the single most desirable. So the timepiece hasn't changed aesthetically in the 32 years since that 1988 model bowed. This looks exactly like a 2015 steel, that is steel bezel and steel case Daytona would have looked. All of which is to say Rolex does not do planned obsolescence. This is a handsome timepiece with a more graceful case profile than the squared off super case we just saw in the Explorer II, and with a 47.5mm lug-to-lug span, it works better on a small wrist than the big Explorer II. This can wear on a wrist as small as 13.5, maybe even 13 centimeters in circumference. Now inside you have the Zenith El Primero caliber 4030. Rolex made some substantial changes. Instead of a mobile stud index, a free sprung regulator. Instead of a flat hairspring, a handmade Breguet overcoil. Instead of Zenith's bidirectional winding system with many internal springs and excess complexity, Rolex used its twin Teflon-coated reversing wheels and simplified and added durability to the winding system. And of course, whereas the standard El Primero was not chronometer certified, this one was. Whereas the standard El Primero ran at 10 beats per second, Rolex tuned it back to 8 beats per second to be super safe for long-term durability. And of course, this timepiece, just as impressive technically as any El Primero, but with the addition of all of those Rolex refinements. It was built in a special room at the Zenith-el-Primero manufacturer, the caliber 4030, built separately from the other El Primeros to Rolex specifications. Zenith only being able to make 25,000 El Primero movements a year during the 90s, split between the Rolex project, Zenith's own chronographs, and customers like Concord. You can see why these are so much less common than the later in-house Daytonas, and why they are more collectible. Now, speaking of Rolex, we can't speak of Rolex without a sub. But again, I don't like the common Rolex models, and while a no date is only a small protest, it is a protest nonetheless. It should be noted that there is no such thing as a no-date Submariner. There are Submariner dates and there are Submariners, and this is the latter, directly related to the very first subs, such as the 6200 of the early 1950s. The modern-day Submariner is immediately recognizable as a descendant of those very watches. The 6204s, the 6205s, the 6200s, all of them are immediately traceable to this aesthetic. Very little has changed, and of course the Submariner, without a date, better balanced than that with the Cyclops Eye. Our own Jason Main is a big fan precisely because of the cleanliness of this dial. It should be mentioned that mechanically, this watch, launched in 2012, the 114060, is mechanically identical to the 116. And this is a timepiece that is 300 meters water resistant, a chronometer, 48-hour power reserve, 4 Hertz beat rate, screw-down trip-lock crown, ceramic unidirectional rotating bezel insert, and of course we have the glide lock system, so you can add or remove 20 millimeters of adjustable length. You could see the increments, 2 millimeters of adjustment, 10 of them, so you can use that glide lock system for precisely sizing, whether you want to just make small changes to deal with the expansion or contraction of your wrist, or you want to pull it all the way out to use over a dry suit or a wetsuit. It is a very, very versatile and handsome watch, and if I were to ever go with a sub, it would probably be a 114060. Now, let us speak of high horology. Enough sports watches, for now at least. Let's speak of Vacheron Constantin, the ultimate dress watch mark. True, a Lange Söhne has been more exclusive in its adherence to dress watch norms, but Vacheron has been doing it a lot longer, since 1755, back when a dress watch meant a gold pocket watch. This is a model launched back in 2007, then as the Patrimony Contemporain collection, the By Retro Day Date. This is the Patrimony by Retrograde Day Date with retrograding day and retrograding date. You can see all applique rose gold indices, rose gold hands, and a silver opaline soft satin finish dial that glows in the soft light of my light box. You will note that the watch is substantial for a dress timepiece, the better to bear the complexity on its dial without crowding. 42.5 millimeters, you can see that the case itself is exquisitely crafted with welded lug profiles. Whenever you see welded lugs, you know that you're looking at advanced case construction. The difficulty being creating those sharp breaks between the lug profile and the case without creating a caterpillar-like weld between them. Removing the material to create that sharp cleft line is artistry of the highest standard. This watch is hand finished inside and out. Throw it on the wrist and you can see the timepiece is broad. It's a rare dress watch that's almost 43 millimeters in diameter, but you can see with the lug-to-lug profile under 50 millimeters and relatively compact, this watch does wear well on a smaller wrist. It also wears relatively flat. Not the flattest, but as you can see, easily fitting underneath a tight dress sleeve or cuff with no problems relative to a jacket. Now the watch is substantial, so if you like dress watches, but you always feel like you're strapping a quarter to your wrist, this is the answer. And it's everything you would expect on the inside. Let me do my best to try to get a shot of this movement. I'm going to sort of invert the strap here. Harrison's going to help me out. But you can see the rotor itself is 22 karat gold and guilloche cut. So use rose lathe guilloche cutting to create a lovely sort of barleycorn pattern on the rotor itself. And then we have a Geneva hallmark caliber 2450 base. I'm going to try to get some more. There we go. There's the light. Caliber 2450, and you can see that it has all of the standards. Engine turned perlage on the base plate, mirrored anglage, guilloche on the rotor, Côte de Genève across the bridges. All the screw heads black polished with chamfered slots and circumference. This is a very accomplished high horology movement, and of course with the bi-retrograde module of Vacheron's own design on the top, it is also a sophisticated machine. You can see this one made since approximately mid-2012, as it features the Geneva hallmark externally on the case, not just on the movement. The Geneva hallmark has, since 2012, been a full watch standard for finish. Crossing the border briefly to Glashütte and the Senator Chronometer Regulator. LMET SLME fully cased up, that is full watch German chronometer certified, not a bare movement test, 42 millimeters in white gold. This watch came out at Baselworld 2013. It features a silver varnished lacquer dial that is made by Glashütte's own dial manufacturer. You can see it is a regulator with your hours, your minutes, and your seconds, and it has a zero reset system of unusual precision. You can see I stop and I hack, but it does more than that. Now, not only have I zeroed the seconds, but the watch actually jumps minute to minute, forward or backwards, so that when you set it, it's always perfectly aligned to the second as well as to the minute. This is an incredibly thoughtful and sophisticated watch with a power reserve at 9, a grand date or panorama datum over at 3, a small AM/PM indicator in the hour register up at 12, and a lovely vintage-inspired railroad track around the circumference against which you can precisely align that jumping minute hand. Turn it all over, and this is arguably even more impressive than the Vacheron, as we have caliber 5801 01. Now it's a 44-hour and 40-minute power reserve. The Germans have been very, very precise about that. Entirely hand-finished. Note the three-quarter style bridge in pocket watch fashion. You have golden chaton fixed by fired blued screws. This is another nod to the pocket watch era, as Glashütte Original's origins run back to 1945, and I should mention they are the legal successor company to the original Lange Söhne. You could see a freehand engraved half bridge for the balance, and then a lovely solar spiral on the ratchet wheel atop the barrel. This is a chronometer of the highest caliber, and it is a caliber of the finest finish. This is as good as it gets. Let's throw it on the wrist one more time, because this is a full-size dress watch. I mentioned that the Vacheron is substantial and has a lot of presence, but so too does this. 42 millimeters for a dress watch is on the larger side of things. This watch, nicely executed with a case that's anything but generic. The lugs are stepped out handsomely, so it's not a blended lug Calatrava design, reinforcing the fact that this is made in the old silversmithing and glass-blowing hub of Glashütte and not across the border in the Swiss Watch Valley. Speaking of the Swiss Watch Valley, there is no more famous name from the Vallée du Jeu than Jaeger-LeCoultre. This watch was launched after the original Master Compressor Diving Navy SEALs line, because the Navy SEALs allegedly asked for a smaller watch. They liked what JLC was doing, and they agreed to lend their name to the cause, but at the same time, 44, 45, 46 millimeter watches were too much even for them. A watch has got to not snag on things. It's got to fit on an average sized wrist. And as the SEALs often say, dynamite comes in small packages. Not all those guys are huge. So a 42 millimeter steel diving watch was perfect. You have a ceramic bezel insert, unidirectional winding. I'm going to let you hear that unidirectional bezel. That is one of the chunkiest and loudest detents I've ever encountered. It's almost like burst fire mode from the SEALs themselves. Now the dial is no joke, with the font and numerals coming from, or I should say the indices and numeral font coming from the Polaris 68. It is a black matte finish to resist glare. The timepiece, of course, water resistant down to 300 meters, features the ingenious compressor crown system. 1/2 turn and it's unlocked for winding and setting. 1/2 turn and you get that 300 meters of water resistance. Note the attention to detail here. On the dial, Jaeger-LeCoultre acknowledging, and we get super close here, that I'm going to get closer. I'm just going to lean out more, and Harrison's going to help me out there. But you can see on the dial, JLC, one of the very few brands to acknowledge that 300 meters is not 1,000 feet. That's downright German of them. Now, the watch is a limited edition of 1,500 pieces with a manufacturer automatic inside featuring a 43-hour power reserve, a free-sprung architecture for shock resistance, 1,500 pieces, individually numbered. You can see the U.S. Navy SEALs warfare device, an eagle holding a trident over an anchor with a gun. That is for those who qualify as SEALs. You don't have to qualify as a SEAL to wear this watch, and that's probably a good thing because, frankly, I'm not up to it, and I was in the Navy. I know what those guys do, and I couldn't get through buds. That's basic underwater demolition school. This is a watch that wears well on a smaller wrist, and the nice thing is, if you don't want to flaunt your spec warness, you don't have to. All of the SEALs branding on this watch is on the case back, nothing to outwardly declare that you are a dreamer or a wannabe, so there's great discretion about the co-branding, and I happen to appreciate that tremendously from JLC. This watch also has a wonderful bellows-style, natural vulcanized rubber diving strap for quick adjustments and absolute comfort. But I was always more a fan of the JLC dress watches, and JLC does them beautifully. This was launched in 2014 at SIHH, and this is the Duometre Quantième Lunaire Grand Faux. Grand Faux enamel dial, you can see it as that lustrous, wet paint-like gloss of a Grand Faux enamel dial, fired at 800 degrees centigrade up to 20 times to create what you see here. The base of the dial is made of white gold, and then a vitreous glass-based paint is applied over that. Now you can see the watch features a moon phase disc as well as a pusher-adjusted date indicator. The purpose of this model was chronometry. It was delivered with a few refinements compared to the first Duometres. First, the smaller case, 40 40.5 millimeters in white gold, 200-piece limited edition. Second, you could see that the bezel is more domed on this model compared to the conical profile of the original. The case beautifully made. We talked about welded lugs earlier, and you could see the sharp break between these lug profiles and the case band. These lugs are welded and not just dramatically broken out, that is, they're stepped up and away from the case band, but you can see how there's double finish with black polish for the lugs and then satin finish for the case itself. Now when you throw this watch on the wrist, you can see it doesn't wear as large as my old Duometre chronograph in 42. This is a Duometre that's more suited to smaller wrists as well as more traditional tastes. Make no mistake, at 40.5 millimeters, it's still large for a dress watch. It just wears a bit more gracefully, and it's a little bit more in keeping with modern tastes than the original Duometre 42, which launched back in 2007, when bigger was better. The timepiece featuring the exquisite dual wing movement, caliber 381, and I do mean dual wing. As you can see, the twin mainspring barrels, one winds while the other ratchets. 50-hour power reserve, 2 power reserve indicators on the dial side. Note the Côte de Soleil, the Côte de Genève radiating out from the balance across the bridges, which are made of nickel, copper, zinc, or German silver, that same golden-hued metal used on a Lange movement. Now the watch has possibly the most elaborate zero reset second system I've ever seen. It doesn't line up the minute like the Glashütte does, but you can see when I pull the crown part of the way, I stop the 1/6 of a second foudroyant, and then I zero reset the seconds. 2 power reserves. 1 power reserve is for running the balance and maintaining constant amplitude. The other power reserve operates all of the indications, the day, the moon phase, and the time, thereby ensuring you get constant amplitude and chronometer grade timing even while running the rest of the functions of the watch. That is the point. You can see that the crown is handsomely double knurled, and it feels like $1 million in the hand. The outer face of the crown featuring media blasting as well as polishing, and that's on one crown. As good as it gets, and again, part of the best of Jaeger-LeCoultre. These are 200 pieces individually numbered with the Grand Faux enamel dial. My own Duometre chronograph, by the way, was the most accurate watch I ever owned, often being able to keep time with the chronograph running to better than 1 second per day. That said, brands that have made the most of their dress watch reputation include Patek Philippe and FP Journe. Now you can see in my left hand the Patek 5140-17. Now this is a Patek Philippe 5140p in platinum, 37.2 millimeters with a perpetual calendar. It has a gloriously flat case profile, less than 9 millimeters thick, and as you can see on its case back, micro rotor automatic with a 48-hour power reserve. Guaranteed accuracy of -3 + 2 seconds per day. You get the open caseback vista of a manual wind and the thin profile of a manual wind, but with the convenience of an automatic. And that is the advantage of a micro rotor automatic. With FP Journe, you get something very different. A larger watch at 39 millimeters. The Chronomètre Bleu launched back in 2009. Let me try to get a little... There we go. Launched in 2009 with a dial that is simultaneously metallic and glossy. A little bit of aesthetic alchemy pulled off by FP Journe himself as he designs all of his dials. There's an off-white printing and there's off-white cream-colored varnish on the hands. So what appears to be white at first glance is actually off-white to better sync with the blue of the dial. Now the watch features a caliber 1304 manual wind, twin mainspring barrels, 18-karat rose gold, and there's a hidden train, so you can't actually see the transmission of power from the barrels to the escapement, though you can see the escapement and you can see the barrels. Note the open valley between them and the barleycorn guilloche on the main plate. You have Côte de Genève on the bridges, you have engine-turned perlage under the balance, and then you have that barleycorn in the gulf between the barrels and the balance. Throw this watch on the wrist and you can see, especially with this interesting saddle brown strap, the watch has a handsome juxtaposition of colors and tones. Wearing flat, of course, under 10 millimeters thick, it is the consummate dress watch, even as its blue-gray tantalum gunmetal-like aesthetic wears well with informal attire. Throw the Patek Philippe on the wrist and you can see that this is a watch that wears flat and minimal. It's also a watch for which I will not prescribe a lower limit. This lovely anthracite sunburst dial and minimal lug-to-lug measurement endearing it to my rather conservative dress watch taste, but also making it viable for wrists smaller than 13 centimeters in circumference. There is no wrist too small except for perhaps a child's wrist to wear this watch. So if you're looking for a men's watch that wears on a truly petite wrist or just for a more traditional 37 millimeter size, this is that. And in platinum, it has a substance to it that I happen to enjoy. Now, a few watches that always seem to slip by from Patek Philippe, the Gondolo collection. And this is the 5200G, the successor to the original 5100 Millennial reference. This is a watch that launched in 2013. It is a day date. It is a power reserve with an 8-day power reserve, and as you can see, a properly sized and shaped movement underneath the case back. Note the triple finger bridge arrangement leading down to the escapement and the balance. That's drawn from old Geneva pocket watches. You could see that the shaped and sized caliber properly fitted to the case, the sign of a true manufacturer, featuring twin mainspring barrels. And with the 8-day power reserve, you have a watch that manages to be both extremely accurate and long-legged. It's difficult to achieve both, but Patek Philippe does. That's the legacy of the old chronometer 5100 and a related movement. You can see that the caseback sapphire is cambered or arced, so that when you throw this beautiful blue beast on the wrist, it actually fits nicely with the watch arcing around the wrist. So while it's a substantial watch at 46.9 millimeters lug to lug and broad at 32.5 millimeters across, nevertheless it wears well on a small wrist, far better than most rectangular watches, and frankly far better than most large reversos. I really like that watch. The caliber 2820 REG, or REC I should say, one of the best in the business. Now here we have two lovely Langes, and I'm going to showcase some of the finest of Glashütte. Now there is a larger watchmaker in Glashütte, several in fact, but I think the most beloved and the most revered is a Lange Söhne. Refounded in 1990 by Walter Lange, the last watchmaking scion of the original founder, who created what would become Glashütte Original and a Lange Söhne back in 1845. This right here is a lovely duo featuring the Lange 1 moon phase in platinum, 38.5 millimeters, and the Langematic from the Saxonia family at 37 millimeters. Both of these watches feature sterling silver dials that have been galvanized to the colors you see here. Throw the moon phase on the wrist, and it feels like an awful lot of watch despite being a 38.5. And the reason for that is it has a platinum case, it has a sterling silver dial, and the moon phase disc itself is made of solid gold. That's a rare refinement that you see on Lange moon phase watches. Turn it all over, you have caliber 901, one of those original 1990s movements. Launched in 1990, the new Lange Söhne would name its movements after the year that work started. So this is the L90. Work started on this 3-day manual wind caliber back in 1990. The caliber 921 in the Langematic started work in 92. So the design of the first in-house automatic by the reborn Lange company started in 1992. White gold, 37 millimeters. The dial features white gold applique indices and alpha style hands. You have a panorama datum up at 12 o'clock with a pusher that is as crisp as a fine column wheel chronograph. Turn it all over and you can see that the rotor itself is made of solid gold and the winding mass outboard is made of platinum. This is the only brand I know of that uses a gold rotor and a platinum mass, not just for winding efficiency, that's a given, but for sheer opulence and excess. You have a freehand engraved half bridge for the balance cock, and that is just as you will find in every Lange watch. And although this is a 3/4 style rotor, you still have the general outline of that pocket watch inspired 3/4 bridge. 37 millimeters, it wears well on any wrist, and this is another watch that I'm not going to prescribe a wrist size. Any wrist, no matter how small, can wear this one gracefully and with real panache. Finishing up with some heavyweights, let's start with the Audemars Piguet 41 millimeter rose gold double balance. The double balance, caliber 5132, gives you twice the mass as there's a balance on the front and a balance on the back. The successor to the 39 millimeter Royal Oak Openworked, it is that, entirely openworked. Or open wrought, I should say. That is the past tense of work. And you can see that it is hand finished. The interior of every angle, a sharp cleft. The edge of every bridge, a mirrored, rounded bevel. And you could see the skeletonized bridge, the first bridge for the balance on the dial side. Automatic winding, turn it all over. And you could see there is a second balance. and the hairspring, another flat hairspring, is 180 degrees out of alignment with the dial side, giving the advantage of an overcoil. So when the watch is in a position such that one beats fast, the other beats slow, to cancel out the effects of gravity on the watch. So not just a beautiful watch and not just a beautifully handcrafted movement, but a technically sophisticated, high-grade timekeeper in the grandest tradition of Audemars Piguet. 41 millimeters like the perpetual calendar, this one is broad across the wrist, though as you can see, it is nice and flat and under 10 millimeters thick. It's also automatic winding and well loomed, and thus surprisingly versatile and practical. Where to end an episode like this? Well, it would have to be something freakishly cool, and I have such a watch. Launched in 2014, this is the Freak Blue Cruiser. Launched as a follow-up to the 2013 Freak Cruiser, this was the first ever family of water-resistant Freaks. You can see the baguette movement is the minute hand. When you lift the Freak plate down at 6 o'clock, you lift it up, and then you set the watch by turning the bezel. You could see the hour hand underneath. You could see that the watch features a full silicon double direct impulse escapement. And you can see that it uses a free-sprung balance with a silicon hairspring for anti-magnetism. The watch has a 7-day power reserve, which you wind manually using the caseback. It is a caseback winder. The watch has no crown. Operating for 7 days in spite of the power-hungry dial display. The timepiece is 45 millimeters in matte finish titanium and wears well even on a smaller wrist. Make no mistake, large and in charge is the style. If you want a small, discreet watch, look elsewhere. The name, Freak, should ward off those of, shall we say, more traditional inclinations or any semblance of modesty. A timepiece that's nevertheless very comfortable and lightweight in titanium. I'm going to wind this one up and fire it up so you can see the Freak in action. Because after all, a watch that doesn't beat is like a diva without a voice. In its glory, the Ulysse Nardin Freak Blue Cruiser. It's even loomed. Email tmosso at thewatchbox.com, guys. Everything you see here is for sale. Prices in the description where I have them. We're improving the set. Bear with me. You guys have been real patient. I thank my crew for making huge strides in our new studio space. Again, tmosso at thewatchbox.com. If you don't see the pricing in the description below, I can get it to you at this email address. Thanks again. Time out, Tim out, and thank you for logging on.